My name is Joanne, and tonight I'm here instead of my husband, who is at home with our children, putting them to bed, which is where I normally am. So it's a great privilege to be with you here all this evening, because I don't think I've been to the 6:30 evening service before. So thank you very much for having me. And I work for Tearfund, which is partly why I'm speaking this evening. And I want to talk to you this evening about following Jesus where the need is greatest. And I believe that where the need is greatest at the moment is tackling the issue of climate change in a global sense. So the first slide that we have up here, this is actually a picture from Malawi during a famine that they had there. And as Vincent and Cuthbert has been talking about this evening, Malawi is like any country. It's got lots of issues and lots of problems, but climate change is really exacerbating to a great extent the problems that they've got. And this is just one example of the impact that climate change is having. Now, probably when you hear about the issue of climate change, you might feel a bit hopeless and powerless, maybe. We often feel this in our lives, don't we? Maybe it's personal issues, political issues, maybe it's bereavement, finances, maybe political, maybe it's Brexit that makes you feel hopeless. And I find it very easy to be overwhelmed in my job. I'm a glass half empty sort of person, so that doesn't help much. But every day, basically, I'm writing and reading about the destruction of God's beautiful world accelerating and the impact that that is having on people in poverty. And those people in poverty, the poorest people in the world, I think, are the people that God has a special place in his heart for. And we are so dependent on this world to live, to flourish. And that's how God created it. We need the air, we need clean air to breathe, we need healthy soil to grow plants, we need water, clean water to drink. But yet for people in poverty, they're even more dependent than we are, because they're often, as Vincent and Cuthbert were saying, they rely on the land for their income and for their food directly. And also they happen to live in countries which are very vulnerable to climate change and environmental destruction as well. The good news is that in the last 50 years, huge strides have been made in the fight against poverty. So half of the people living in poverty in the last 50 years have actually come out of poverty, which is amazing. And that's good news to celebrate, and that actually shows what can be done and what can be achieved when we put our minds to it. However, this is at risk because of runaway climate change as a result of humans burning fossil fuels. And in the last 40 years, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere have doubled. We're also breaching other planetary boundaries as well. So we're causing climate change, human-induced climate change, but we're also using too much water. We're also polluting the land and the water to a rate where it can't recover by itself. Pollution, regardless of climate change, pollution is now one of the world's biggest killers. So the way that our economies operate is not sustainable, and it's coming back to kind of bite us, as it were. We cannot continue to live as we are. We are addicted to consumption in the West. I don't know if you saw this week that riots broke out because parents particularly were really keen to get the offer of Build-A-Bear. People queued for miles. This is what got people out on the streets. And then last year it was Nutella, where people were having a punch-up in the supermarket over a special offer there. Yet in the countries where I'm visiting, the reality for people is very different. I went to Brazil and visited a place called Recife, a city there, and met a lady called Maria das Graças, who lived in a favela. And she is now seeing her home flooded 6 times a year because a river that runs through their community, that used to be a place of life where people would fish and swim. It's now flooding because more frequent rains are coming each year as a result of climate change. Also, people are throwing their rubbish into the river, which doesn't help much either, so the water's also, the flow is also getting blocked. But these two things together is causing huge problems for them, because when floods come, people drown, diseases are spread, and people lose their possessions and homes. And in Malawi, as we were hearing, average temperatures since 1960 are up, rainfall is decreasing, and when rains do come, we hear about the flooding. And the reason that they flood is because the rain is falling on very hard, dry soil, because it's not sort of coming more regularly. So the water just runs off the surface and creates flooding, but it also doesn't go down into replenishing the soil and helping food grow, and also going down into the groundwater that's needed to replenish groundwater. And nearly half of all children under the age of 5 in Malawi have stunted growth due to malnutrition. Climate change is a reality for poor people now. It's also creating a huge number of refugees as well. So climate change now creates more refugees than war and persecution. And there are 41 people a minute who are fleeing their homes because of extreme weather events. Now, these people did not contribute to climate change. And they live in countries that haven't really contributed many greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. But they are the ones who are experiencing it. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury was at the London Stock Exchange, and he said, "What we are seeing in climate change is something that will move people on a scale that we will have never dreamt of in the history of humankind." Tearfund works in 50 countries around the world, and 15 years ago, when we were the first agency to start working on, development agency to start working on climate change because we saw the huge threat it posed, a few country reps from those 50 countries would say, yes, we're beginning to see a changing climate and we're concerned about that. Now, when we all meet together, when all our country reps come together, it's something that all of them are talking about. So what are politicians doing about it? I hear you ask. Well, 3 years ago, in Paris, a big international agreement took place after a huge amount of campaigning from churches, from individuals, from organisations to try to get governments to agree how to tackle this problem. And government said, we do not, very sensibly, we do not want runaway climate change to happen. So we need to limit the temperature rise to a certain amount. And if you limit the temperature rise, that means you need to cut greenhouse gases by a certain date. So they agreed in principle, they agreed in theory, but the actual commitments that each government made to cut their greenhouse gases will actually mean that, for example, Shanghai, Miami, Rio de Janeiro, Osaka, Alexandria in Egypt will all go underwater in several decades from now. That is catastrophic, uncontrollable climate change. And that's if governments actually say that they're going to do what they're going to do. So if they don't even meet their commitments, which governments are sometimes known for doing, then, the reality, the future is much worse. And it may be a future that we don't see, but it will be a future that our children and our children's children see. And this is caused primarily, as I said, by greenhouse gases that have been emitted from wealthier countries, by our industry, by our cars, by our flights abroad on holiday, by our homes, by the incredibly wasteful way that we eat and consume products. Yet it is the poorest people who are the most vulnerable to it and who are suffering it, the worst effects of it. I would argue there was nothing more important politically. So you're probably now feeling a little bit depressed. Welcome to my world. However, hope remains. Next slide. Now, this is just so funny because I was just Googling Tearfund images. I should have gone on the official sort of Tearfund library, but I didn't. I was just Googling Tearfund images to be quick. And I was Googling, like, the cross and Tearfund. And this picture came up, and I was like, oh, that's a great picture. And then Cuthbert told me this afternoon it's actually him, which is just amazing, but in like 2005 or something. So that's just, obviously, this was meant to be. But yeah, you may be feeling hopeless, powerless, angry at the injustice of this situation. But how many times were things totally hopeless in the Bible? How many times were the odds stacked against the people of God? Sam Crabtree, an American church leader, says, God was not done when Noah was in the boat. Sarah was barren. Joseph was in prison. Moses was on the run from Pharaoh. The children of Israel were pinned against the sea. The walls of Jericho blocked possession of the promised land. Gideon was hiding from the Midianites. Samson was seduced by a woman and blinded. Ruth was widowed. David was mocked as a boy facing a giant. Job's children were all killed. Government officials persecuted Daniel. Jonah was in the belly of a fish. Paul couldn't get rid of his thorn. And Jesus was put in the grave. God is not done. I'm so thankful to work at Tearfund because it's especially special this year because we're celebrating 50 years of being around. But we really put God and Jesus at the centre of what we do. We pray together, we read scripture together, we worship. And I also love working at Tearfund because the way that we work in developing countries is also we don't plant our flag in places, we really support local partners as well. And I believe that's so, like the Malawi Eagles, that's completely true to the gospel. But without our eyes fixed on Jesus and the hope that he brings, it is so easy to despair. It's the easy thing to do, but it's not what we are called to. We know that we have an eternal hope. There are so many examples in the Bible and pictures of this. In Colossians, we have a picture of Jesus reconciling all things, whether things in heaven or things on earth, to himself. In Revelation 22, 1-2, we have a beautiful picture of the new earth that will be created when Jesus returns. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So a beautiful picture of abundance. And in Revelation 21, Jesus says, behold, I'm making everything new. This enabled Paul in Corinthians to say, 2 Corinthians, now we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this surpassingly great power is from God and not from us. We are pressed on all sides, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. And then in 16, therefore we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, yet our inner self is being renewed day by day. For our light and temporary affliction is producing for us an eternal glory that far outweighs our troubles. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. What a hope. But we're not going to leave it there. We can't leave it there. We can't just say, let's sit back and wait for Jesus to come back, as actually somebody I met believed that we should do. When do we do that on anything else? When do we say, no, it's just too difficult, we can't re-evangelize the nation, we can't, we shouldn't ever do anything, basically, as Christians, that would be saying, we'll just wait till Jesus comes back, so we'll just sit here and wait. He is our ultimate hope, and that is our ultimate hope, a new heaven and a new earth. But it's actually not what Jesus calls us to now. We have the next slide. We are a sign of the coming kingdom. We, as the church, are a powerful sign now through what we do and say of that eternal hope. In Matthew 5, Jesus talks about us being salt and light. In Luke, he commands us to love our neighbour. And in Micah, to bring about justice and mercy. This is central to the church's purpose. It was why the church is such a vital agent of change. And the world desperately needs change. It desperately needs leadership, I can tell you. When we act on issues of poverty, praying, giving money, campaigning and changing our lives, we are answering God's call to live out our faith. We are loving our neighbour in Jesus' way, whether they live next door or thousands of miles away. And when the local church joins together with the global church, the capacity and influence, especially on behalf of poor people, is a mighty force for change. And we can really knock on the doors of people in power, which is what I do in my job. But when you can say to politicians that when they've received, hundreds and thousands of letters, doors open. If it's just me or myself, they're not interested. But with the force of the church and of people and of Christians behind us, that is when doors open, because politicians care about what their electorate think. I often think of the example of Jubilee 2000, which some of you may be too young to remember. But this was a huge movement, global movement, really led by the church to cancel the unpayable debts of the world's poorest countries. And in the year 2000, it culminated in that year. And this actually started with a woman who used to work at Tearfund, who had a dream and a vision of this scenario, of the world's, of the debts, of the unpayable debts of the world's poorest countries being cancelled, which at the time just seemed completely ridiculous. Why would the global economic system ever agree to such a crazy idea? But it happened. And Tearfund believes in the church, and we are asking you to join us in a movement of Christians who are leaders and world shapers who want to follow Jesus where the need is greatest. Tackling climate change and other environmental threats which will set back reducing poverty. So what can you do now, apart from praying and giving, which we've already heard about? There are two actions I'd like to invite you to take. So the first one is to change the way that you live. We believe it is so important that we act with integrity on this issue. If we are asking others to reduce their impact on climate change, as Christians, we should do that ourselves, yeah? And also, it's about discipleship. We are responding to God's command to care and to steward his creation, and to love our neighbour and to seek justice for those who need it, or as we say at St. Peter's, being society transformers. Now, these are all things that we are doing as a family, and we've been doing for a number of years. I'm not asking you to do something that we aren't doing ourselves. So there are three things in your lives that you could do that I think would, that from research that has been done, would have the most impact. So the first thing, may not be possible if you're renting, but worth looking into, switch to green electricity and gas. Our church switched last year, thanks to the hard work of Stuart. It's quite complicated to switch a church, but he did it. And we are now totally run on green electricity and gas, which is amazing. Well done, St. Peter's. It's actually very easy to do it as an individual. Rod and I changed the other day between two green electricity and gas providers, and it was very, very simple. And there are good tools out there for looking at costs and things like that. So that is the first thing you can do, switch to green electricity. It's a no-brainer if it's possible to do in your home situation. The second thing is about transport. So this is about stopping or cutting down on your flying. Now, I realise for some people, totally stopping flying is going, for kind of personal reasons, is going to be difficult if you have family in other countries. But really thinking about how can you cut down. And as a family, we don't have family in other countries to visit. And we are saying, yes, it would be lovely to go to some tropical island somewhere, but actually, we're just amazingly privileged to be able to go on holiday anywhere. So let's, go somewhere we can drive. And that's what we do. Also, you can cut down on your driving as well. So you can commit maybe to not do any car journeys that are under a mile. And you will find that you are actually a lot healthier as a result as well. And our air that we're breathing, in London we have illegal levels of air pollution, which causes huge problems, particularly for people in asthma. There are so many benefits to this. The third area is reducing meat and dairy in your diet. We try to have sort of 3 or 4 vegan or vegetarian meals a week because producing meat and dairy is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. It's very carbon intensive and also produces a huge amount of methane, as you might be aware, which is a very strong greenhouse gas. So reducing meat and dairy in our diet, or go the whole hog, that's the wrong word, and go vegan. Secondly, you can join Tearfund campaigns and you can take it up a level. So you can do the individual and the personal change, but then you can use that and take it up a level and ask our government and companies and investors to do more and create bigger change. And if you sign up to Tearfund campaigns, you'll get really easy and straightforward ways to do that. So at the moment, there should be on your table some cards. At the moment, the action that we're asking people to take is to write to the UK government to ask them, stay with me, to put pressure on the World Bank to spend more on clean energy for the world's poorest people. So at the moment, the World Bank spends most of its money on getting energy to poor people on fossil fuel-based energy sources. Not good. Because obviously that's going to exacerbate climate change. Now, of course, we want to see people in poverty get access to electricity, so kids can do their homeworks in the evening, women can give birth in clinics safely, which they're not able to do now. But it's going to be much cheaper, and it's going to be much better for them and for everybody else if we do that in a way which is clean and is also off-grid, especially in rural areas. You can give access to people like things like solar panels, as we heard earlier. So there are cards on your seat. We would love for you to take part in that action and sign that, and you can give cards to me. You know, I believe that we are called, as the church, to live faithfully as followers of Jesus, following him where the need is greatest. We can be bearers of hope as the church. We can point to a different reality by living differently, acting on behalf of others, and worshipping him with our whole lives. Let's pray.